Is there enough time? Many Americans pose that question to themselves on a daily basis. From getting a cup of coffee to going to the gym, time is always a factor. But how do you answer that question when you're attempting a new budget plan for the United States of America? Are 2 terms enough time in office for a president to truly effect great change? 2 consecutive terms is the current norm and law for the U.S. presidency. Many say that 2 terms is plenty of time, but others claim it's not enough. By the end of this speech, I hope to convince you that the president does indeed need the opportunity to run for a 3rd term. To do this, I'll first look at the background of the 2-term rule and follow that by addressing the current crisis of time facing President Obama. But as I said, the first things first, why all the fuss about 2 terms or 3 terms or unlimited terms as president? Well, up until about 1940, there really wasn't a fuss. Our nation's first president, George Washington, held office for 2 consecutive terms. After those terms, he stepped down despite being asked to run for a 3rd term in 1796. This 2-term tradition continued uninterrupted for almost 150 years. That was until Franklin Delano Roosevelt, commonly referred to as FDR, took office as our nation's 32nd president in 1932. FDR gained fame by starting the climb out of the Great Depression, as well as leading our nation through the first years in World War II. He was able to do this because he effected great change in our country by getting us out of the Great Depression, and also because the people needed a consistent leader during World War II. But many people already know this about FDR. What you don't know, though, is he's the first and only president to run for and get elected to more than 2 terms. FDR was elected to a 3rd term in the election of 1940, just at the onset of the U.S. involvement in World War II. He actually went on to run for and win a 4th term in 1944, but died shortly after taking office. After the death of FDR and the horrors of World War II had began to pass, Congress passed the 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. They began passing it in 1947, and the amendment was ratified later in 1951. This new amendment made Washington's 2-term tradition law. Many heralded this change as a good check on the power of the presidency, but some questioned its logic. After all, FDR's leadership is arguably one of the top reasons the United States came out of World War II victorious. So my question is this: if it took FDR 13 years to bring the United States out of the greatest economic depression in our history and lead us to the greatest war in our history, should not every president be given the same opportunity to effect great change? On the flip side of that, is every president actually capable of effecting that great change? Keeping that in mind, the next logical question is, what's happening currently with our presidential term limits? Well, on the surface, nothing. But as we all know, time rarely operates on the surface of events. With that in mind, let's consider the current events facing President Obama and the challenges with time. On the forefront of everybody's mind is our debt crisis, which is represented most boldly by our $15 trillion national debt. President Obama summarized his plan for dealing with this debt in 12 points, but for the sake of time, I've boiled that down to about 3 main issues. The first point will be creating tax cuts for lower-income families and businesses. The second, creating green, tech-based jobs. And the third, enabling workers to lobby for better wages. Now, the logistics behind all that are relatively unimportant for the purposes of this speech. What is important is ask yourself that if President Obama were able to actually do all of these things, could he do them in enough time, i.e. within his 8-year presidency, to truly affect our economy? Again, keeping that in mind while we consider some other problems. The next problem facing our country is the war overseas. Now, I know we have troops coming home at the end of this year, and I'm all for that. But that still doesn't change the fact that we have ongoing conflict in Afghanistan. So far, the plan has been to gradually scale down troop presence until we can reasonably leave the region in the hands of a stable government. That being said, the unfortunate part of that is that all of that takes time the president does not have. Consider this. If President Bush were allowed to run for and was subsequently elected to a third term, he theoretically could have overseen the resolution of a conflict he began in the first place. Again, keep all this in mind. Finally, a big event that has plagued the White House most recently is the gridlock in Congress. This gridlock stemmed from our debt crisis. Eventually, Congress agreed that something needed to be done and effectively created a resolution that meant that they were going to reconvene later to discuss it, which did nothing. The reason this occurred is because the president is trying to enact quick legislation on a legislative body, i.e. our Congress, that our Congress can afford to wait out for during the course of their lifetimes. Congressmen, in case you don't know, are able to run for unlimited amount of terms, which basically means that they have their entire careers to wait out a president who only has 8 years to effect new law. With only 8 years, Mr. Obama does not have the time to argue with a petty, party-controlled Congress. With that in mind, our last question is, what does all this really mean for term limits? Well, allow me to explain. First, a third term would give a president 12 years in office, just a little over a decade. Now, in that decade, I believe that a president would be able to truly enact the political and economic plans and allow those plans to bear fruit during their presidency. Also, the only president to serve over 2 terms, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, brought the country out of the Great Depression and led us to victory in World War II. Consider also that if President Obama only has 8 years to enact a plan that will bring us about $15 trillion of debt. Just to put that in perspective, your average American takes around 30 years to pay off their mortgages, and those mortgages are on houses that cost close to $224,000. And again, that's an average. $15 trillion versus $224,000. Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, does it? Additionally, senators and representatives enjoy unlimited terms. A president only has 8 years to affect a legislative body that can afford to wait them out over a lifetime. Indeed, senators and congressmen should have term limits as well, but at least an additional term for the president gives him enough time to work over a stubborn House. In conclusion, unfortunately humanity is limited to a 24-hour day, so we cannot be given more time to accomplish our day-to-day. But we can give our president the time he or she needs to effect the change that he or she set out to do. By allowing a third term, we can give the president some bargaining time with an idle Congress. Ideally, senators and representatives will be limited to 3 terms as well, so they would be less passive with their time in office. As one can no doubt assume by this speech, the answer to the question, is there enough time, is no. But the good news is that you can truly affect change and be a part of that change by calling your local congressman and joining the fight for a third term to give our president the ability to pursue a third term for the betterment of their presidency and for our country.